continuación, música para el cine, aquí en Filmarounds.
Bernard Herrmann. The name is not particularly familiar. Certainly not like the names of the Hollywood movie stars. Or, for that matter, the directors that Bernard Herrmann worked with during his tempestuous career as a film composer. Bernard Herrmann wrote music for a long list of famous movies, making his debut with Citizen Kane and finishing with Taxi Driver.
Of cinema itself that it needs music. The theater doesn't need music really. Drama on the stage and a certain amount of live television doesn't. But the minute you do a story that is done on film, music becomes almost imperative.
A Herrmann score, like his scores for Alfred Hitchcock's thrillers, is never merely background music, but always a full partner to the action on screen. In the era when film music came into its own, Herrmann's work helped to shape our very idea about what music does for movies. A career that spanned 4 decades had its roots in radio, where Herrmann began as a conductor in 1934. The aspiring composer, an active member of Aaron Copland's circle, wrote his first dramatic score at the age of 22.
They used to have public broadcasts. I think it was called In the Modern Manner. And coming out in the middle of it was this young man. He sort of shuffled out, sort of glowered at the audience, and had written this beautiful setting of La Belle Dame sans Merci.
Ah, what can ail thee, wretched night? Alone and palely loitering, the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing.
And I was just carried away with this music. It was wonderful. Next morning I was on the subway, and I spied this young man, and I went over and told him he was just wonderful. He was very taken aback and terribly suspicious.
I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild.
Herrmann divided his time between conducting the CBS orchestra and composing music for pioneers of radio drama. In 1939, he took a magic carpet ride to Hollywood, courtesy of that other radio genius, Orson Welles.
Every radio program tries to be more dramatic than life, as every play tries to be more dramatic than life, and every movie, not less so.
All the Mercury Theater was out there, the whole crew. Orson had a big house with a big lake in the middle, and he would ride around on a surf mat. He had 4 secretaries posted around this lake, and each one would take dictation of any thoughts that he might have had as he lay in his surf mat.
Mr. Kane, I'm from the Inquirer.
Are you through with politics? Am I through with politics? I should say vice versa. We're going to be a great opera star.
Are you going to sing at the Metropolitan, Mrs. Kane?
We certainly are.
Charlie said
if I just can't build me an opera house.
That won't be necessary.
Herrmann impressed Hollywood sound veterans with music that was remarkably dramatic, yet never obtrusive.
Bernie understood the type of orchestration that would go underneath dialogue. It made it possible for you to have more music underneath dialogue, and very effectively. And then, of course, Orson's insistence on good original recordings, so that you had a good, intelligible dialogue track and a well-orchestrated music to put underneath it. The combination gelled, and as a result of it was a good combination of talents.
He had his own conceptions of sound. We tried to please him, of course, and be as expressive as we possibly could, a lot of vibrato, so forth. And he immediately shut down on that. Oh no, he says, this is the wrong. He says, cool it down. I don't want a hot sound. I want a very cold and very factual. There had arisen by this time what we call the Hollywood style, which was to play beautifully and with a lot of expression and vibrato, especially with a master like Al Newman. But he didn't want that. He would say, no, forget about your old conceptions.
Al liked intensity, and that drove him nuts. He wanted a nice sonority without that intensity. And it was, they were both effective, but widely different.
On the other hand, he would ask you to do things with a great deal of expressivity, but he knew how to mix the shots.
He had this wonderful sense of orchestral color, which he got from all those years of study and of conducting the CBS Symphony. And he would also use these marvelous sonorities, which were not exactly original with him. That's not important. Sometimes they were, but it was the way in which he used them. In Citizen Kane, you know, those low things with the bass clarinets and the use of low trombones and the tuba and all the rest of that. That dark color is something very particular to Benny, which has been copied a lot by others. I don't think it was in any special way innovative from a standpoint of being different. It was just Benny's particular talent and his gift for doing very simple things, you know, and it immediately made its mark. Everybody knew that there was a remarkable new guy in town.
When sound came in, a lot of music was put on soundtracks just to keep the soundtrack alive. Then you started to get people like Max Steiner came along, and they began to particularize the use of music. I mean, you know, the villain, and bum, 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 dee, then you know it's the villain, right? During war pictures, if we're to see a British warship, Max Steiner would tend to go, da, 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 dum, bum, bum, da, dum, 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 you know, Britannia rules the waves. Now, that's an intellectual communication, because through music, he's telling you this is a British warship. It makes music seem very important. And one of the things that Steiner did early on, by these kinds of techniques, people suddenly, this is a specific piece of music for a specific dramatic event. Now, what Herrmann does is something that is not intellectual, it's emotional.
People have a direct emotional response to music, and Benny's music, and the best film music, I believe, is an expression of the interior psychological state of a character in a scene. and Sisters, for instance, he used a kind of nursery-like motif to express the fact that this girl was once a Siamese twin. And the night before, the lovemaking has reawakened the traumas that she went through in childhood.
Surprise.
When the attack comes with the butcher knife, which is extremely violent, instead of just playing the action, the music is violently angry, and Benny is playing this rage inside Danielle, which is almost like a child's taunt, this playground kind of nya, 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 nya. So it wasn't just action or suspense he was playing mental aberration and murderous feelings.
Sound with the orchestra. He did things in his music, the way it integrates with the picture, which I still don't think any other composer quite achieved is the wrong word, because that implies they were setting out to achieve it. I think with Benny this just happened. I mean, that was just the way things were. Things just fell into place, just as he himself really appeared to fall into place completely effortlessly right from the start.
He came in at the height of the Middle European composers, the Max Steiner, the Dmitri Tiomkins, Daniel Amfiteatrov, even Alfred Newman is basically a Middle European kind of music. And they were, you know, sort of post-Tchaikovsky romantic sound. And that kind of sound, first of all, didn't suit Benny's personality. And I think that he wanted to find an individual way of expressing not only himself, but saying that to create good film music, you don't do it through a series of tunes necessarily. You do it by creating atmospheres, by manipulating the emotions of the audience through sounds and a kind of magic.
His style was actually quite circumscribed. If you really get down to brass analytic tacks, he didn't have that wide a vocabulary. He didn't need one.
It's very typical Herrmann, because we're talking about, you know, the use of slight material. This is played by 8 horns, and the first 3 bars just sound like. That's very, very typical Herrmann statement. Now, you never forget that. That's the thing about this kind of thing. You just don't, I mean, that impresses itself on your mind, and that's what he's on about.
What's going on in Herrmann is that the basis of his musical language is tonality. And tonality where you have, you know, always logical resolutions, not always, I mean, they're obviously a good deal more complicated than that, but where tonality basically implies resolution, right? And tonality has certain elements to it that lead towards these resolutions. Now, one of the most common sounds you hear in tonality is the so-called interval of the third, which would sound like this as a minor third and like this as a major third. And you hear this, for instance, in the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But rather than move towards some kind of resolution that gives us a sense of rest, of respite, of comfort, of we finally wrapped everything up, Herrmann tends to use the thirds in parallel series. So if Herrmann had written Beethoven's Fifth, it would have sounded more like this. And this this is exactly the sound you have at the beginning of Herrmann's score for Brian De Palma's Sister. Now, this is not going anywhere. This is not going towards a resolution. It is just sort of remaining static. It is remaining suspenseful. It is not getting you towards a point of rest. A good example of this use of parallel thirds can be heard, for instance, in this kind of suspense music that Herrmann did for Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much. And what's important about this is not that it is revolutionizing musical language, but it's revolutionizing, to a certain degree, the relationship of music to the visual image. Because Herrmann, I think, realized more than almost any other composer that if you use the standard rhythms and structures of music, that they're going to work against the cinematic flow. Herrmann uses very short cells of musical meanings that he can really play with almost at will with respect to the cinematic image and not have it interfere.
Where others of us would struggle with the idea of writing a piece of music that might even make sense apart from the film, Benny was doing some very simple little stunt which worked marvelously. North by Northwest is a case in point, because here you have Benny Herrmann, of all things, playing a fandango. And you've got to say yourself, a fandango, to yourself, what is a fandango doing there? And it's also very, very simple, and it repeats itself constantly, you know, dum da dum dum da dum bum ba da ba da bum. It goes on and on and on. Benny was a genius with a repeat sign, but it works. Where somebody else would sweat blood trying to do something in a relatively subtle manner, when Benny had to unleash something, he would do it, you know, with everything he had. He would smite the world with trombones. And it was very effective, and I liked the whole idea that he had the moxie, you know, the power to do this. You will hear that in Citizen Kane. You'll hear it in a lot of different places where he has to deliver, and he'll just sort of deliver a blow that will knock you out.
Sent to the violin teacher when he was about 8. As all good Jewish fathers would send their sons if they had musical talent to study the violin. And he disagreed. I think the teacher made him play Rustle of Spring. And he wanted to play something very esoteric. I forget the exact piece. And the teacher argued with his interpretation of Rustle of Spring, and he then lifted the fiddle. He said, and broke it over the head of the teacher.
Bernie was at odds with everything. He was not sociable. he never became a part of Hollywood. He hated it, and regarded all motion picture music as a bunch of junk, except what he wrote. And not a rational man. He didn't behave rationally.
He was crazy about his dog, Twy, and he could be a very loving, gentle, warm-hearted, sentimental man, you know. But Benny would fly into rages at various things. But was Benny responding to that rather strange and dark side of him? I used to call him a virtuoso of unspecific anger. And the nice thing was that he was very generous with it. It included his friends as well as his enemies. Arthur Knight, who was a very famous film critic, once called me up and he said, do you consider Benny Herrmann a friend of yours? I said, of course I do. He said, well, then you should have been around at the party last night. There was a big party in which among the guests there were producers and directors and such people. And Benny said in a loud voice to Arthur, Raxon, your friend, is he still teaching down at USC? And Arthur said, yes, he was a professor there too. And Benny said, film music? Arthur said, yes. And Benny said, what does he know about film music? Now, this is the guy who recommended me to John Houseman to do The Bad and the Beautiful, and he wants to know what I know about film music. Well, that was Benny. You know, when he got on this thing where he was striking out against all the things which failed to acknowledge him as the king of creation, and he began to have doubts concerning the world, which is obviously not made to his specifications, and his way of dealing with it was to run around and throw darts at people. And, you know, later he realized that I must have found out about it and had a hell of a time looking me in the eye. But I never held it against him because I knew that was Benny. Others of his friends left him. You know, they finally got to the point where they couldn't stand that.
He was superficially a very gruff character, you know, kind of outrageous in his speech and his opinions. You've heard all those stories about Herrmann. He just had to be gruff, I mean, because I think it's the kind of person that has to say, either make a joke or do something gruff, or otherwise you're going to cry or say something warm or sentimental. You don't want to do that. But I think there was a lot of that in Herrmann. And a lot of it comes out in the music. So listen to The Ghost of Mrs. Muir.
About there. Too close by the sound.
It's the loneliest sound. Like a child lost and crying in the dark.
He's lost, all right. With the captain cursing a blue streak and wondering why he ever went to sea instead of opening a grocer's shop like a sensible man. Fogging the channel.
Typical Benny Herrmann, punctuating the dialogue and the rise and fall of the music, and the fact that he was doing something about the ocean, which was in the background of all this, and consequently manufactured this passionate and ungratified love.
I have no desire to see men.
You should, Lucia. You're a confoundedly attractive woman. Or hadn't you noticed? Really, my dear, you owe it to yourself.
Yes, Daniel. Good night.
Good night. My dear.
He liked to impress women. And sometimes a man that was perfectly nice, he would start edging against them, challenging them to duels where they would make mistakes. But he was very affable to ladies. He took to women, and he was very nice to me. Our relationship was one of mutual respect, and he never tried any of those tantrums or didos, even when he was getting a divorce. He felt he was exhausted, and he felt confused, But he had love for my cousin, and that was, he wanted another woman. He wrote me a lot of letters. I at all times tried to make life as comfortable as I could. Servants, money, and complete responsibility of my fatherhood. I entered into work that was extremely distasteful to me. Movies, commercial radio. I never had time for my own reflection and work. I always had to go out afterwards alone. Everybody else had company. Then the prospect of only work, only the piano waiting, only more and more facing of my own lack of achievement, the passing of time, and the hollowness of it all, the onslaught of my enemies. It gives the impression that I drove him to the commercial work, and I didn't. But I think what he really hoped to be was a symphony conductor. That's what his mind was on, that he could play all the music that he admired in others. And it always impressed me that movie music was something that he was doing to kill time till he got to be a symphony orchestra conductor.
He felt that the music of Handel and of the composers he most admired burned with a fierce light. That was his passion. He championed Bartók and championed Ives when neither of those composers had much of a constituency.
As a teenager, Herrmann discovered Charles Ives' music at the New York Public Library. He befriended the older composer and maintained a lifelong affection for the music and for the man.
He was sort of a man who didn't care about where he stood in relationship to other people. He really didn't. And he would just play you the piece, and if you liked it, he was happy, and always used to say, oh, well, you know, if you find something boring, add something of your own. He did. I remember when my career continued and flourished, I tried to get Stokowski to do Ives. Had nothing to do with it. He used to say to me, you keep Ives for yourself.
By the age of 40, Herrmann had written a symphony and an opera. But gradually, he began to realize that his fortune lay with a genre that had chosen him more than he had chosen it. Film music.
Le problème de la composition de musique de film est terrible parce que c'est un élément très important du film, et c'est vrai que le plus souvent, le compositeur ne lit même pas le scénario. On lui donne le film, une fois qu'il est terminé, on lui donne un temps extrêmement court pour composer la musique. En plus, c'est une musique qui doit être assez précise, avec des points de repère précis, avec des temps très, très limités. Et moi, je suis toujours époustouflé de la manière dont les compositeurs s'en sortent.
Well, of course, at Herrmann's day, it was very different. You worked at the studio. But in any case, there would come a time when the film was assembled, and you'd sit down with whoever the designated person was, director, let's say, or the head of the music department, or one of his appointees. And you'd sit down and you would then talk about what kind of music the film should have, what sections of the film should have music. And those, in the old days, those sections of the film would be extracted for you by a person called a music editor or a music advisor, and they would be described in words, accurate, tenths of a second, and that you would work from what they called cue sheets. The composer would then start to write those pieces of music. When that's done, an orchestra is engaged and you go to a studio, and I think what most people probably don't realize is that the film is projected in a studio and you conduct the orchestra as you're watching the film. And I don't think that Benny ever thought he was writing down when he did a film. I think he was a serious composer who was a serious composer wherever he wrote.
Well, when Benny scored a picture and you were on the call, you knew that you were going to have one of the rare times of your life.
There was one picture on dangerous ground. And at the end, when we were finished with it, he asked the powers that be to give credit to the Viola d'Amour. And they said, oh, we don't have a card for that. And he said, put it on my card. And that's where it is. The composer, Bernard Herrmann, Viola d'Amour, Virginia Majeski. And that was really rare in those days.
Do you like that piece of wood? My brother found it for me. He said I should always have beautiful things to guide me. I don't know your name.
Wilson. Jim Wilson.
Jim Wilson. You can tell a lot of things about a person from his name. From his voice, too. If only I could really see you. If I could be sure.
Any musical score for a film, even for a poor film, will reach millions of people. Now, whether they listen to the music with the attention we hope that people listen to in a concert, or I can't answer, because I'm not so sure that people who go to concerts listen any more carefully than people who go to the cinema.
In his most widely seen appearance as a conductor, Herrmann led the London Symphony Orchestra in Arthur Benjamin's Storm Cloud Cantata. It was a cameo for Hitchcock.
Herrmann devrait diriger. Et c'est quand même étrange qu'un type qui préfère être chef d'orchestre ait définitivement été davantage un compositeur, alors qu'il y a tellement de chefs d'orchestre qui voudraient être compositeurs et qui réussissent difficilement à l'être. Oui, c'est l'insatisfaction humaine, ça.
In the Herrmann-Hitchcock collaboration, you have this constant dialectic going on between the two. Herrmann was sort of the quintessential romantic, prone to either violent fits of temper, extreme excitement, happiness, or basically you're sort of 19th century manic depressive, I think, cast in a 20th century old New York City Jewish role, as opposed to the Irish Catholic English Hitchcock, who was totally unflappable and totally cool and express all of the rage and tantrums in images.
Hitchcock is an extraordinarily well-organized man in making of his films. The actual shooting process to him is already boring because he has made the film in his head. For example, he will never give an actor direction how to walk in and out of a room. He will accept the fact that the man had to walk into the room, and if that actor walks that way and it's done with conviction, he's quite happy with it. And so to work with him with music also is a great deal that way. He will say, I have left reel 3 for you.
Herrmann and Hitchcock share an affinity for Gothic horror, and nowhere is their partnership realized more ambitiously
than in the 1960 shocker, Psycho.
Take a look on my side of the tram. We can see the house on the top of the hill from the 1960 thriller, Psycho. That famous shower scene took 7 days to film at over 78 different angles. And you might say, why so much trouble for such a short scene? But let me ask you, what scene from that movie do you remember?
When we get into the Hitchcock films even more deeply, we see that he developed a chord, again, build up of thirds, but this is a more complex chord. It's what's called a seventh chord, which becomes what we hear in Psycho, and it becomes what we hear in Vertigo. There's a very uncomfortable feeling of irrationality in this because it doesn't go in places we listeners of tonal music have been hearing it go to all of our lives. We don't expect to hear a chord like this insisted on for its own coloration. We keep expecting the music to at some point calm down and to get us out of this obsessive sound. But no, it's a point he keeps coming back to.
I was home one night and Psycho was on, and I saw a scene in which Janet Leigh had stolen some money. The scene consisted of 3 very simple shots. There was a close-up of her driving, there was a point of view of the road in front of her, and there was a point of view of the police car behind her reflected in the rearview mirror. The material was so simple, and yet the scene was absolutely gripping. And I reached over and I turned off the sound to the television set, and I realized that the extreme emotional duress I was experiencing was due almost entirely to the music.
What you actually saw was a very good-looking girl driving a car. Could have been to the supermarket. And it said to me, well, put voices occasionally. They're missing the money now. I said, that's all right, but that still doesn't make it terrible. And that's when we both agreed the idea we'll bring back some music. It gives the audience something terrible is going to happen to this girl. It's got to.
J'ai toujours été frappé dans Psychose de ce moment formidable où la nuit commence, avant d'arriver au motel, où il se met à pleuvoir, où les essuie-glaces tournent. Et ça, plus avec l'extraordinaire bout de musique, une angoisse qui n'a absolument aucune raison d'être, née de l'ensemble des éléments, quoi. Ça, c'est de la métaphysique, ça, pure. D'un seul coup, qu'on se dirige littéralement vers quelque chose. Et quand on arrive au motel, il est bien évident que c'est l'endroit où les choses vont se passer. Et là, tout est possible.
The shower scene has been a sequence of much discussion. Hitchcock did not want music for it. And I said, well, leave it to me and go away on a holiday. And he came back and we showed him the film with music. And he said, of course we'll use that. But I said, Hitch, you said absolutely no music. He said, well, improper suggestion.
C'est comme des violons aigus, c'est comme des cris d'oiseaux. Et comme Norman est empaillant d'oiseaux, je veux dire, c'est presque le coupable qui est désigné. Mais et c'est pour ça que c'est très fort. En fait, on ne sait pas pourquoi, mais on sent que ça convient parfaitement, parce que c'est au fond de nous-mêmes, nous savons sans doute que que c'est Norman Bates qui tue quels que soient les trucs. Donc c'est une confirmation. Et en plus, c'est fait comme des allaitements de personnes qui sont en train de soulager d'une obsession. Non, c'est génial, ça.
The Herrmann-Hitchcock partnership spanned 11 years and 8 movies, but came to a bitter end in 1966 with Torn Curtain. Herrmann's score was only partially recorded. Eventually, the film was released with a score by John Addison.
That was when Hitchcock had begun his decline, and he'd been such an arrogant, dreadful person to so many people, and so ruthless and cruel, that when he started on his way down, at the slightest slip, you know, they know what's happening here in town, people began to give him a hard time. And one of the things some of the guys at Universal did apparently was to say, now, you don't need that old-fashioned score. What you need is something which is with it now. Well, Benny did the score for this crazy ensemble, but I'm sure it was brilliant because I heard the tapes. And also I heard from the musicians in the orchestra who were playing that when he finished with this main title, they actually cheered, you know, and they're pretty blasé, but they loved what Benny did because it was so striking. And the thing was that Hitchcock later appeared on the stage.
Hitchcock walked in, and he said, "What is this? What kind of music is this? It's not what I want."
But Benny, who cared a lot for Hitchcock, said, "Listen, Hitch, we've got the players, we've got to pay them anyhow. Why don't you let me finish the recording, and then you can decide." Hitchcock said no, because he wanted to humiliate Benny. And so they called off the session, which is a big deal, you know.
And so we just all went home, and then we were sitting there having a cocktail and talking it over in his bedroom, because that's where his music room was. He said, "Go to the other line. I want you to hear this because Alfred Hitchcock is on the line." And he did get a chewing out. They had a yelling conversation between them, yes, both of them. And they both had it on, and they still never resolved it.
And it was, I think, the great tragedy in Benny's life, the great professional tragedy, of course, the break with Hitchcock. And what he felt was that Hitchcock had capitulated to the pressures being put upon him to get pop into his scores, and he didn't think that an artist of Hitchcock's caliber needed to, and certainly should have capitulated in that way. We'll probably never know the full story. I think there are probably all sorts of complex, momentous issues. I think, for instance, that from my own experience of working in films and having come across directors and their various ego problems, I think there might have even been a sense in which Hitchcock was beginning to resent the enormity of the contribution that Benny was making to his films.
The highlight of Torn Curtain is a brutal killing sequence. In the released version of the film, it runs for 10 minutes. Herrmann did score the sequence, and the music was among the cues that he recorded. We can even tell just how the music was to have fit the action.
His romantic ideals were integrity and the purity of his art. He was extremely intolerant of dictation from producers and directors who didn't know a damn thing about music, and he sacrificed commissions and friendships over that. He also resigned from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences because he felt that there was insufficient acknowledgement of the composer's contribution to films. So he was a Quixote character in that sense. He was tilting with windmills and getting hurt.
But he was gravely wounded by all of this stuff, you know, what Hitchcock did to him. Hitchcock owed him everything. and had the loyalty of an eel.
La brouille, hein. Enfin la brouille, c'est pas de la brouille, c'est vraiment entièrement la faute de Hitchcock dans ses rapports avec Herrmann. C'est qu'une fois qu'il s'est débarrassé d'Herrmann, toutes les musiques d'Hitchcock n'ont été bonnes que quand elles l'imitaient, quand elles imitaient la musique d'Herrmann. Et le reste tombait très à plat. Enfin.
As the major studio setup broke down and the independents came in, I just don't think that it was in him to deal with the emerging independent film structure here. I think it must have felt chaotic to him, although I wish he had stayed. I hadn't seen Benny for a very, very long time because, as we all know, he went to live in England in the last years of his life. We were talking about current films, and that time I was very taken by a score for Murder on the Orient Express, an Agatha Christie, very unreal kind of whodunit, very campy. Richard Bradley Bennett, after having thought the thing over, when this train, the Orient Express, pulls out of the station, had written a sort of pastiche waltz. I thought it was absolutely brilliant because it conjured up the period, you know, and it was sort of tongue-in-cheek, and it was telling you, listen, you don't have to take this too seriously, and one shouldn't have taken it too seriously. Anyway, I said this to Herrmann, and he went mad. You know, it was the old Herrmann again. He said, no, it was awful. He hated it. And he said, how could you write a waltz about it? He said, this was a train of death, you know. Well, I said, Bernie, you know, I don't know. I wouldn't have taken it too seriously as a train of death, but Bernie would, you see. That was the thing. And I mean, it leads you into a possible area of weakness, of overstatement, you know. And Bernie would have played it as a train of death, and it wouldn't have worked in this particular instance because it's a bit of fluff, you know. And that was the thing about Herrmann. Herrmann was a really superb composer writing superb music with strong statements. If the picture couldn't stand up to that kind of strength, then the picture would collapse underneath the score. But Bernie's internal flame burned very, very, very strongly. And he had to take those kinds of things seriously. And he had to address them with passion, because none of these things were a joke to him.
Herrmann could take death too seriously for a director's taste, as in the music he wrote for The Flight of a Scarf, in a film by Francois Truffaut.
Je suis Julie Colère.
To avenge the accidental shooting of the groom, her childhood sweetheart, the bride seeks out and does away with 5 men.
François a été un petit peu déçu par la musique du foulard. Je crois qu'il voulait que la musique soit aussi légère, entre guillemets, c'est pas de la musique légère, mais qu'elle soit belle, mais qu'elle n'appuie pas sur l'histoire qu'elle raconte. Comme la musique de Vivaldi dans les scènes où Julie Colère va tuer.
C'est très joli. Je ne l'avais jamais entendu.
Truffaut a suggéré que cette musique reparte dans un sens pas plus joyeux, mais plus léger, aussi léger que le foulard. Donc ils ont fini par enregistrer un mouvement du concerto pour mandoline de Vivaldi.
Silence, moteur. Musique 6, deuxième.
l'obstination d'Herrmann d'un côté et l'obstination de Truffaut de l'autre a fait qu'il y a un compromis entre les deux.
Until the very end, Bernard Herrmann invented and reinvented the music of life's dark romance.
I wanted to make something called like New York Gothic. And I realized, I said, Michael, if we do it, the only man who could do the score would be Herrmann. That's it. There's no one else. I couldn't certainly start with any of the new people. It had to have that feeling of Marnie. It had to have the feeling of Vertigo, of Psycho, of The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, of All the Money Can Buy, all those pictures. I remember him telling me on the phone in Amsterdam, I don't know anything about taxi drivers. I don't want to do a film about that. I said, no, it's not really about a taxi driver. It was called Taxi Driver, but it's about this guy. Yeah, let me send you the script. And I don't know if you can say his score was what I expected. It was Herrmann's music. It supplied the psychological basis for it throughout. You know, you see Bob looking this way, left to right, but it's the music under that carries, that supports that image. The other big thing about this score, besides the brass and the sense of strength, was the element of jazz. He felt he was starting something new with his work by combining the two. Yeah, and it seemed to really work. Really seemed. I mean, I had a young man in China, in Beijing, 4 years ago, from Mongolia, following me around, asking me what instrument was it? Was it an alto sax or a tenor sax? And then he talked to me about the loneliness of that the music and the film evoked. And how do you deal with the loneliness?
I'm working long hours now, 6 in the afternoon to 6 in the morning, sometimes even 8 in the morning, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. It's a long hustle, but it keeps me real busy. I can take in $350 a week, sometimes even more when I do it off the meter.
His music is like a vortex. It goes deeper and deeper and deeper. It reminds me of some of Wagner and Tristan and Isolde. It reminds me of some of that. It has a feeling that it never comes to completion, and it starts all over again. Just when you think it's finishing, it starts all over again. It's kind of like a whirlpool and a vortex, emotional one, a psychological one, and has deep psychological power. And it doesn't matter what language you speak. It affects you emotionally and psychologically. And they're up for it. They'll go for it every time. It's such a cliche now, because this stuff is universal.